Welcome. My name is Raoul Straathof from Katana. Today we're going to have a conversation with Stephan Spijkers. Stephan, could you perhaps give a short introduction of yourself, and then we're going to discuss on what we're going to talk about.
I'm Stephan Spijkers. I'm the co-founder of PIMvendors.com. We give independent PIM and product data advice, and we do that based on at least on my personal 10 to 15 years experience in e-commerce mostly. And we try to give this independent voice and independent education, independent information space for product information management instead of this colored information that you would usually see on your Google searches.
Yeah, very nice. Thank you so much. Today we're going to talk about PIM migration, something that you have a lot of experience with from yourself, but also from the PIM vendor side. And what we mean with PIM migration is that either you're coming from another PIM tool to a new PIM tool that might fit better, or coming from an old situation in working in spreadsheets or misusing an ERP or even a web shop. That's what we try to cover for today. So first question, what do you see is the main reason companies are considering a new PIM tool or migrating to a new PIM tool?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think the main reasons for migrating to a new PIM or selecting a new PIM that we see, at least in practice, is frustration with the old, right? And the old ways of working. And that could be because the current solution you're using is no longer fit to the task. And that solution can be, as you said, can be another PIM, can be Excel, can be an ERP. And usually there are three drivers for that, which is the complexity of the product data, because you're adding attributes, regulation is requiring you to add attributes, and you can no longer manage all that complexity in your current solution. It could be internationalization, so having to add all these kinds of extra languages, which means you basically have to add another layer of all your existing product information, and just basically growth, right? Quantity is also a reason to move from one system to the other. Not I mean, you cannot manage more than 25,000 records, I think, in a Google Doc. You don't want to manage all that product data in an Excel, or your ERP is no longer fit to the task of managing that quality of product. So those are the main reasons we see for that.
And so if you want to move away from an old situation, move into the new one, what are the most common situations that you see a company starting off from in that PIM migration? So you see, of course, with Excel sheets, so the data is scattered across multiple sheets in different databases in the system, or misusing their web shop. And what are the most common things that you see? Companies come to you guys for, hey, we need a new PIM solution. What kind of things do you find?
It really depends on where they are coming from. If they have an existing PIM, which we don't see that often really, we see mostly first-time PIM users. So most of the times they come from a situation where they use another solution, and that is usually not just one solution, but a combination of solutions, because there is no single repository for product data when you are not using a PIM. So that means part of your product information is in your ERP. There's always product information in your ERP. The master data is usually there. Sometimes you have a translation, the German translation lives on the German web shop. You have some additional marketplace enrichment attributes that you have only in Channel Engine because you add them specifically for Amazon or for Bol.com. And then there is, of course, your own web shop where, because you want to filter on some attribute, you have added a specific meta field just for your web shop. So what we usually see is this mix, this spaghetti of product data, and that when people come to us and they want to migrate to a new PIM, we have to bring all that data together, cleanse it, and only then start the migration process.
Exactly. Okay. So that's also what we see a lot at KatanaPIM as well, is that usually it's different departments having to work with product information, and then why they're trying to use or set up a new PIM solution is to want to centralize the data. But then what we see a lot as well is then that would also then sort of create a new department in that company who's going to focus solely on managing that product data. So what you see with the IT landscape with an ERP and e-commerce system, but you also mentioned the channel integrator like Channel Engine as well. Is it also something that you take in consideration when discussing maybe a new PIM solution or setting up a PIM migration? Is restructuring the organization as well? Is it something that they have to take in consideration?
It is super important to have that. We call that data governance, right? So have that responsibility embedded somewhere in the organization, and it's people, process, tools also in that order. You have to have people that have a responsibility for that governance, for that data. And as you said, it comes from multiple departments. So there's multiple responsibles and multiple departments and tools and multiple processes involved. We have to then bring that together for one new process or multiple processes, but at least one single entity to manage all that product information, the dedicated PIM tool, and bring that together under, start with people, one person or one team department responsible for the product.
Yeah. Yeah, what we see a lot as well is then at the beginning stages of the conversations with, hey, they want to migrate to a new PIM tool. Usually, the initiative has been taken by somebody from marketing or maybe a new e-commerce manager. Or who do you think needs to be involved in that migration project? So, what kind of key players do you see there that are needed?
Yeah, that's a great question. Like, who do you need for a successful PIM migration? What you mentioned is that you have different stakeholders, and there's usually one stakeholder that takes the initiative, and that can be IT, that can be marketing, that can be category management. Depends a bit on where they come from, and also depends a bit on which requirements they bring, right? So IT wants single sign-on and wants all these technical requirements that they bring. Marketing just wants to have a unified customer experience, and depending on who comes first to us or to that PIM selection, they bring a different set of requirements to that table to get, of course, a tool and a process that is used, a PIM process that is used, and a PIM tool that is implemented successfully. You need to have all these stakeholders at the table. And basically, that means everyone that uses product data, which is a pretty broad group of people, right? That can be the warehouse management system and logistics, that can be finance, that can be, of course, category management and purchasing. I think usually what we see is it's IT, it is the product department, and it's the marketing department. Those are the main people. I think what we usually try to do as well, in addition to having the decision makers at the table, is also have the users of the tool at the table, right? So that you do not just have a tool that is selected by either IT or marketing or product, but also have the users there during the requirement gathering sessions and also the selection and demo sessions, because they are the ones that are going to actively use the tool and they are currently using the alternative solutions that are currently out there. And having all those voices at the table is, I think, important to get a PIM that is not just selected,
Yeah.
but also successfully migrated to from their existing solution.
Yeah, because it's also my experience is to get the actual users involved as well, because I think they are going to be one of the loudest ambassadors of this. After you migrated to a new PIM, you need them to be actually ambassadors of the platform itself, so they can keep using it. Because one of the things that we see as well, if you don't get the buy-in from the key users, probably after the migration is done, they probably lose interest and they're not going to use the PIM. And then the decision maker is like,
Yep.
okay, I'm paying for this. We're not using it. What?
They're just going to go back to Excel or back to the ERP or the combination of tools that they use, and they'll find ways. And I think it's also important to take them into the consideration and into the migration process as well, because if you don't cover all their requirements, they need to have another tool or another way to work with that requirement. So it is super important to work with them, involve them, as you said, if you want to have that successful migration and not just a tool thrown into the organization by IT or thrown into the organization by the decision makers and by management, and have the actual users just forced to use it.
Exactly. Yeah. And what I might experience, they are also asking the most interesting questions in the whole selection process because they're actually working with it. So that's a nice part. Talking about the users and the decision makers at the table, what are one of the biggest misconceptions or mistakes that they make with a PIM migration? So they selected a PIM solution, but what are the biggest mistakes or misconceptions they did leading up to that process?
It's a good question. I think the biggest mistakes we see in leading up to the migration process is not fully mapping all the requirements from all the different stakeholders. So that basically during the migration process, you notice that, oh, we actually need to add all these extra requirements, and you get this scope creep, and yeah, it doesn't typical IT project management stuff, but you see that a lot. But I think even before that, it's the buy-in from the different stakeholders. So even if they have the requirements met, they need to be on board on the selection process. They need to feel heard. As you said, like if you have only decision makers at the table, but not the users, they'll definitely want to be involved and feel you need to involve them to have a successful migration. So I think those two from a sort of people and process perspective. And I think from a tooling perspective as well, you need to embed it in the organization. And that is, yes, people, right? Trained, and they need to feel heard, and they need to have their requirements met. It needs to fit into your product data process. But in the end, PIM is pretty, a dedicated PIM is pretty central in your organizational architecture. And I think that is often underestimated, especially by the first-time PIM users, where they think like, oh, it's just another tool, but it's a pretty central tool to your whole, I would say, primary process where products are created and onboarded and then sold on different platforms, or at least published to different platforms.
Yeah.
And you bring all that product data together. It's so central, which also means that from an IT perspective, it's central. And you have all these different feeds into it and out of it, and not managing that correctly or not embedding that PIM correctly is, I think, a third thing that we've seen during migration process.
Yeah, that's also what we see. Scoping is the main thing, but scoping is from the IT perspective. So what are my toolings around it? So what is my ERP? What is my web shop? What are the dependencies there? But indeed, what you said as well is also how do you scope the requirements in the company is what we see as well, because now everybody's dependent on product data, but everybody's dependent on a different part of the product data. And now, who are you gonna let work? Who is gonna work in the PIM, and who's definitely not gonna work in the PIM, and who's just getting and retrieving that information? And we see also there's the success of a good PIM migration is to cover that upfront on the project as well.
How do you manage like the difference between, I mean, when you get a new tool into an organization, there's always like this, let's fix all our current IT problems with this new tool, right?
Yes.
So then you get like, oh, we actually need a pricing and promotion tool. Can we do prices in PIM? How do you manage that scope, right? So you started with the scope as an important
Yeah.
topic. How do you manage scope?
Yeah, so I think what we do is we have a clear understanding of who we are and who we are not. And I think who we are not is also very much in line who we do not want to be. And that's also saying no. So for the client to make the right selection of a PIM tool is also for us as a vendor very important to make the right selection of the client that we want. So let's say pricing tools, we are very clear we do not offer a pricing module. We can handle prices as a data field in the PIM. That's not a problem. And you can do some things with pricing, but it's not built for it. And we're not going to expand our functionalities on it. So telling that story up front for us is very important on also informing the client that they are they make the right decision. Because if they don't make the right decision and they went into the PIM migration with us, we're not going to have a good project. So they're not going to be happy, then we're not going to be happy. And in the end, you're going to split and everybody lost a lot of money and time. So that's very important. And it's still a learning curve. That's something I think that you keep on doing with all these new projects. But telling who you are, what you stand for, and what you are definitely not, I think that's very important part, at least from a vendor perspective.
Do you have customers that you have seen during selection processes where you said, no, we don't do this? They select another tool that claims to do this, right? And then after this unsuccessful migration, 6 months later, 1 year later, 2 years later, they come back.
We have a couple that came in either under the assumptions of functionalities that might be covered by the other solution, or assumptions based on pricing. So we try to offer a very straightforward pricing module. And then with other PIM vendors, they came to the conclusion that, hey, this feature is covered behind the paywall. So now instead of I have a cheaper solution, now I want to continue, but I want to, let's say, export, for instance, my data. Okay, now I have to pay a lot more money just to export my data. So that's what we see as well. And also in our beginnings, that's also something that we notice. So with the startup phase, you usually overpromise and then sometimes you underdeliver because of circumstances, and then you lose that client. But now I think we get our stuff a little bit better in order now. So now we see it also the other way around. And it's just also strengthens our story on who we are, but also who we are not. And I think that really helps in that PIM migration process as well, and that selection.
I mean, it's a dialogue, of course, between the customer and the vendor. And as a vendor, you can easy to overpromise, right? You always want to say yes, especially sales wants to say yes, but then the solution engineer says no. And it's painful if that happens like 18 months into the integration process, or they say no, but they say yes, but it takes, I don't know, 20,000 euros more. That's painful. That scoping and then doing that scoping up front and making sure that all the stakeholders are there at the table when the decision is made is, I think, one of the main reasons to prevent this, right? So getting
Yeah.
all those requirements in scope before you actually start the whole selection and migration process. And I think one thing that I would like to add maybe is not just your current requirements, right? Because yes, everyone knows what they're currently doing, but you also want to make sure that you don't choose a PIM for the coming year, but you choose a PIM for the coming 5,
10
7,
years. Yeah.
10
Yeah.
years. So if you're planning to internationalize to Germany and France and have multiple languages
Yeah.
in your PIM, in the coming years, then you need to make sure you also take it into consideration when selecting a solution. Make sure that that support is.
That's very important one. And I think to come back to the stakeholders, I think what worked for us really well is that you said sales always wants to say yes. That's of course common. I think for every sales type of company. What we noticed also the stakeholder on the vendor side is one getting a sales guy involved to guide the sales process, of course, but also get a more consultant or a product manager or owner also involved in the scoping, so more on we call it the deep dive demo. So have somebody from the product team deliver also the requirements or talk about the requirements and show what the functionalities and the solution could be. So you always have somebody from within the company to have a fair approach to what the PIM can and cannot do, and maybe what it can do in the future as well. So I think that also from stakeholder management, that could also be very wise to have that.
It is difficult though, right? Because which requirements are must-haves, which are nice to haves. If you give people a list of 500 requirements, the customer always wants all of them, and the vendor always says like, "Oh, we can do everything, and if we can't do it, then we can build it."
Yes.
Of course, I think one way to short circuit that 500 questionnaire process is by synthesizing the key requirements into scenarios. That's at least what we try to do during those selection processes. And I think what you call the deep dive phase, like the deep dive demo, make sure that during the deep dive demo, those scenarios are being touched and covered so that at least all the stakeholders and all the users see what the PIM actually does in practice.
Exactly. I think that's very smart. And that comes maybe to another point, and that's the expectations when you're doing a PIM migration or selection. What kind of knowledge would you expect the company to have in-house or maybe hire, let's say, from a PIM vendors or other consultancies? So what kind of knowledge do you expect the company to have before starting that PIM migration or starting that project?
Yeah, it's difficult because especially when considering that most companies have not used a PIM before going into that migration process, it does take a different mental model of your processes and of your IT architecture. And if you have never worked using that mental model or that approach with a PIM as a centralized hub for your product data, it is difficult to like think from that perspective. I do think it makes sense to have an expert help you during the migration process and help you scope the most difficult topics, like, for example, actively work with you on creating the product data model. And then we usually work backwards. So we look at your output channels and what you need to have in the end from a sort of output perspective.
Yeah.
That's, of course, always driving the complexity, and then move forwards into the process and into the data model and see what you need to then do. But that's a difficult thing, especially because you have hierarchies and interdependencies and replacement products. And how do you do this efficiently and effectively for your custom personal organization, right? Everyone is unique, maybe not as unique as many customers think they are, but they are definitely unique. So getting help on those key critical things is very important. I think also what is often underestimated is resources, just from a, I want to call it a copy and paste, but from a onboarding perspective. Like you have all these different sources of data that you touched on, like there's some data in Excel, there's some data in your e-commerce platform, there's some data in your ERP, and now it needs to come together into this single repository of all that product data. The expert can help you map relationships to different tools and that product data model, but then someone needs to have the time to fill all that data and onboard it. I think that is often, I would say, a mismanaged part of the migration.
Yeah, so the actual hours that a company has to spend themselves or have to free up to really onboard a PIM well. I think you covered a very important one, at least what we find very important is the data model. So for us, we try to make the onboarding process pretty straightforward. So onboarding your product data into the PIM, that's not the most difficult task. That's basically almost like the easiest part to get the data into the PIM. But there's a very big part project and a lot of times a knowledge gap with the client is how do I structure my data model, as you just said, is taking consideration, hey, I'm setting on a Shopify. So Shopify requires some sort of data setup, but also I set on marketplaces. So I have all these marketplace requirement attributes and all these kind of rules that you have to take in consideration by building up that data model. And I think that's one of the key successes of the onboarding process, because once you have the data model, then you can just onboard. And I think one of the things that we looked into a lot is working with product variants. So working with product variants, you can go with a lot of levels. I think market standard is working with a grandparent-parent-child relation, but a lot of times not all the e-commerce solutions cover 3 levels, they cover 2 levels, for instance. And then you go to the customized and they might want to have 4 or 5, depending if you sell, let's say we have a flower client that sells flowers online. They basically have 5 to 6 variations on the same product type. So how do you handle that? And also, do you advise to always get outside help inside? Or do you think this is something that a company can do themselves?
I think if you want to get outside help, it depends, of course, on the organization itself. I do think that from a resourcing perspective, like, do you have time to do this and do you have the resources to do this? And an expertise perspective, that is unfortunate. Yeah, let's do that. It's not a live session. Sit down. Not have it in frame when we start.
Yeah.
No, so what you mentioned about getting outside help for your migration and for setting that up, I think that really depends on the organization. It depends on the expertise that the organization brings, and outside experts usually have dedicated expertise that they got from working with multiple clients. But it's also the resources. Like, do you have time as an organization? Do these stakeholders have time to do the migration, to set up the data model, to migrate all that data, to cleanse that data? And I think that is, again, often mismanaged or underestimated how much time and expertise it actually takes. So would I advise it? It depends. If you have a team that has done these migrations before, you see that often in, I think, more mature organizations. Definitely you can do it with an inside team. But it will be very unfortunate that if you do not have that expertise and you start with that migration journey, having it take 12 months instead of 3 is costly, not just from people need to be involved for those 12 months and you pay license fees for 12 months, but also from a opportunity cost, right? Because you don't have a working solution for those 9 months that you're extending that time of the go live and that time to value. So I would definitely take a look at that as an organization and make that business case. It's in the end, it's a business case.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And really to touch on that real shortly, there's a difference choosing an open source PIM solution or a SaaS PIM solution. Is there a difference in the kind of knowledge that you would need for a PIM migration?
We do see that many of the open source solutions are these fix everything in one solution type of setup, and that there's maybe not so much costs in the licensing part because it's open source. There are some negligible costs in the hosting part, but most of it is in the sort of customization and management part and configuration part. There's actually no difference in total cost of ownership between SaaS tools and open source tools. We do see there's a difference in the cost of ownership from an expertise perspective because the SaaS might be limited, like you can't customize it to the full extent, but it does give you that framework that maybe you cannot change that framework, but it does provide this framework which you can use to structure that process and helps you to also change your own internal processes to make them more efficient. So I don't think there's a difference in the total cost of ownership. I do see a difference in the expertise required because using a SaaS tool is easy for every user. Using an open source tool, I mean, in practice is, of course, manageable. Configuring it, customizing it.
It's needed as well. Very good. So one of the questions is, you're starting your PIM migration. At what point do you pull on the brakes because it's not going well? So what are one of the key indicators of a migration going wrong that you have to take consideration?
That's a good question. So what are the key indicators for migrations that are going off the rails? And of course, first is timeline slipping, right? But I think even before that, you see that in the resourcing of the project, right? So if not all the stakeholders are involved, or they don't make time for all the meetings, or make time for the demos, even they're not present, you see that, you feel that in the organization. So it's I think on that level is one of the main key indicators, like resources are not being allocated well. The second one would be you discover things during the migration or during the implementation process. So, which should not be the case. Like, you discover new requirements or you discover processes that were not uncovered, but that have an impact on the product data process. And then I would say finally is that same sort of discovery, but then on a tooling or IT perspective, where there's actually more tools using product data than previously thought and previously scoped. So there's like 3 extra channels that were not in scope previously, but they do need that product information or they do need some customization. So those 3 things I would say are indicators of
project gone wrong. And should companies be wary of stopping a migration in process with new knowledge? So what you see a lot, of course, is both sides, so the vendor but also the client, is then trying to do everything just to make it work. And in the end, in a year or so, they figured out, okay, it wasn't going to work based on what we found out during the project. Do you see that as well? Or what would you advise companies who are in the middle of that migration and feeling there could be a mismatch, either on the vendor side?
Yeah. So I would advise companies that see this happening, that see that timeline slipping and that see these mismatches arising. In those cases, I would say like stop right away and rethink the whole process. Of course, prevention is better than curing in a situation, but continuing during 6, 12, 18 more months and then discovering that there's no fit is even worse. Throwing good money after bad is I think, the worst possible outcome for everyone. It's not good for the vendor. It's not good for the agency that's doing the implementation. It is not good for the customer, of course.
Yeah.
So I would advise, like, if you get these signals, if you see this happening during the migration process, better to call it out immediately, have this all hands meeting with all the stakeholders and all the different involved parties, and have that frank discussion like, hey, this is going to be successful collaboration, knowing what we know now. Of course, like, getting all those requirements in scope before you get to that situation, much better. And it's unfortunate that we see lots of customers struggling to make that budget available and make that time available to really get into the nitty gritty of their requirements and their processes and their people. But if you then start and select a tool and start the migration process, better to stop it after 3 months than stop it after.
Exactly. And what we see a lot in our experience as well, because a lot of times it's very hard to scope, especially with new PIM users. So the clients who are having their first experience with what a PIM can be for their company. It can be a very big project. So before you find out that a migration is going wrong or a project goes wrong, you're probably already too far out, or at least it feels like you're too far out. So what we try to do now is working more with proof of concepts. So making the project a lot smaller. So then saying, okay, we're just going to onboard you for now. So we're going to take a short period of time. And we're just going to onboard one of your product categories. So to see how it goes and see if we can get that live on a marketplace. So just focus on that one thing. So then we have the whole process of migrating a small piece of your data pool, getting that small piece integrated into the PIM, then seeing how it goes live on the marketplace or either on your web shop. And then if that's a success, then everybody can shake their heads. Okay, this is going to work. And now we're going to put down the rest into the PIM. Is it something that you see more often? Do you think that's a smart way to go?
Yeah, I really like that proof of concept driven approach to prevent these issues arising. And I would say, even if they arise, then you don't need to like throw the baby with the bathwater. But doing these proof of concepts, and especially what you said, these end-to-end proof of concepts, right? So take one product category, not just onboard it to the PIM, but actually like cover the full process from onboarding, enrichment to publication, the marketplace or web shop or whatever it is. That covers all the different scenarios basically, and then you can learn so much from the complexity in that organization, requirements that were not discovered, all those things. And I would say, it's good to then, if there's a mismatch, to say, hey, let's stop for now. But it doesn't mean that you need to stop the whole process because, of course, vendors can grow and change their roadmaps to make sure that those are aligned. And agencies can be flexible as well to find different solutions to find those specific requirements that you might have. So it doesn't mean that the whole PIM process, then the whole PIM migration then stops. But it's better to then, after maybe the proof of concept and see what you have learned, rethink the next steps instead of just continuing down, hoping for that successful implementation and go live in 20.
Yes, exactly. And taking the learnings with you in that next step, in the next category, or whatever it is. All right, I migrated all my data in my PIM. So now I did the whole onboarding. I had my data model set up. Everything is there. I put it in the PIM. Now I need to go live. What are one of the biggest mistakes companies make with the go live? What are key steps to take before you actually go live with your PIM?
That's a good question. What do you need to do before you go live with the PIM? I think, like you said, like if it's a big bang moment, then you're doing something wrong because there should be already a small go live or test run before that.
Yeah.
But I would say no, there's no real difference between the small proof of concept going live or the small categories that you're adding on top of that and the big go live. It shouldn't feel as a big bang moment. Things tend to turn into long overnight shifts and weekends of work and uncontrolled go lives because there's always something that you have missed. I think successful migrations are gradual and agile, maybe even with small steps and small parts going live every few days.
So then if I look at the IT landscape, I have an ERP, maybe a WMS, I have a web shop, I have a marketplace integrator. So I have all these kind of tools, maybe a print solution. Would you then advise to, okay, first let's cover the ERP, make sure that's done. Then we go to the next tooling. Then, so go from tooling to tooling. Is it more, would you advise to go about it like that?
Yeah, would you go from tooling by tooling with the go live, or would you go live with all the tools at once? I think it does make sense to start with one tooling or the minimal viable toolings that you need to bring that one category live and that proof of concept, and then work from there. In the end, of course, you need to have all the tools covered and integrated. Before you make that map, that go live map, that roadmap together with the agency and with the vendor, it is definitely possible to have systems that need actual continuous live product data and systems like WMS that might even update every time a new product is added, but not need to have that direct integration from day one. So I would say find those minimal viable product type of tools that need to be integrated for that go live, start from there, and then add the tools that, yes, need product data, but might not need the live feed, or find a way to bridge that process or that time in between where one part of the organization is live on the PIM and the other part works with an export from the PIM, but it's not integrated in the live PIM.
Thank you. I'm out of my questions.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Cool.
There you go.